Okay, so let's talk about the Southport attacks. We've gleaned some new information this week. We know that the suspect has been charged with possessing a terror manual and having this poisonous powder called ricin. Luke, obviously there's legal difficulties in speaking around this case because it's an active court case, but it also feels like there's perhaps a reticence to revisit what's been going on here.
Yeah, so it's important to say that there are active criminal proceedings. We can't say anything which even risks prejudicing the outcome of those. The defendant has a right to a fair trial. I'd also say that police investigations are always long. They always take a very long time. Digital material, which is the subject of these new charges, at least in part, takes a long time to, for example, obtain from a device. So there is a clear explanation possibly as to why it took a long time for this evidence to come to light. Similarly, they would have had to have, it's alleged in court that he was in possession of ricin. That's a detail that has been reported, and that would have required testing by the police, and there are all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't immediately go public with this information. I think that it, at the moment, is very, very unclear as to exactly who knew what when. Mm-hmm. The Labour government have come out and said that they only found out about the possibility of new charges 3 weeks ago. In my view, that's totally acceptable and reasonable. Why would the government be kept up to date with necessarily every detail of an ongoing criminal investigation? That could in itself create real political difficulties, and you would want to create a kind of cordon sanitaire between the two. But I do think, having said all of that, we are at some point when this process has concluded, do need to have a reckoning with precisely how the British state responded to the summer riots. Because on the one hand, there was obviously a real urgent need to have a policing response to the riots themselves. They were awful, appalling, violent incidents, which involved in some cases attempted murder of large groups of people. So that demanded a significant police response. There is also another response which is still ongoing, which was effectively the policing the expression of particular opinions around the riots and particularly online. And I've been working with people who are accused of those offences, and I can say that there are some borderline cases. I think I can say that. So all of this will have to be worked out. I do think, though, that the conspiratorial side of the discussion is actually worrying, because I certainly don't think this was a purposeful cover-up by anyone, either in the government or within the police. And I do think we need to be very careful about calling for more information about criminal proceedings. There is one argument to say that there perhaps is space to allow the public to know a little bit more, a little bit sooner. But I'm not clear that in this particular case, there was any significant delay that wasn't actually justified. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even at the beginning when we didn't know the suspect's name, that was clearly explicable to the fact that he was a minor. Although, having said that, it probably would have been better to have known the truth earlier, not least because that information vacuum seemed to be filled with outright mis and disinformation.
No, absolutely. And the fact that when the... essentially the restriction on releasing his name was waived because he hadn't actually turned 18 when they released his name. They did it a bit ahead of time because they felt like we've got to fill this vacuum. I think shows that there is a discussion to be had about more transparency, about being as upfront as is humanly possible. You don't have to necessarily take as read or just assume that there was some sort of cover up here to suggest that around any kind of case like this, there's always that kind of clearly a kind of tentativeness on the part of people in authority, the part of the police and so on, in terms of what actual information to release, often bred, I think, of a kind of prejudice that you can't talk about these things openly, otherwise you might create some kind of response. And arguably, we saw the complete inverse of that. We did have an information vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by conspiracy merchants and hard right agitators pushing fake names around, which certainly egged on, if nothing else, the violence and the racist violence and the targeting of mosques and so on that we saw in the wake of the Southport killing. So I think there does need to be a reappraisal of that. And also the way in which in the current moment, these new charges, the ricin charges, as well as the alleged possession of the terror manual and so on, when you've got MPs trying to just ask the simple questions that need to be asked, who knew what, when was the Prime Minister notified of these new charges and so on and so forth, even that request being cast as conspiratorial and dangerous, and you shouldn't be talking about it. You should just leave it to the authorities.
And Lindsay Hoyle saying you shouldn't raise these things in Parliament.
At all,
where they're exempt from these charges of contempt of court.
And there is a danger that I think Starmer starts to hide behind this all-purposes excuse of this is an ongoing investigation, this is an ongoing trial. We don't want to prejudice it, and therefore shut up, because there is obviously questions to answer, as Luke raised at the beginning, about how the state responded to the crime rather than the alleged crime itself. So it's all of that is kind of being thrown together. But I do also agree that there's also a way in which, if there was an element of caginess on the part of the authorities in terms of when they release this information, again, it's just been used by all of the bad actors to justify some of the misjudged to outright dodgy stuff people were saying in the immediate aftermath of the Southport killing, pushing fake names, for instance. Yeah. So there's, in that vacuum, you not only get the kind of the conspiratorial things being filled, you also have a lot of room for people to basically just sow so much distrust that they can kind of give themselves cover for some of the things that they did and said in the wake of those awful killings.
Yeah. And Luke, I mean, just returning to the sort of summer riots and some of the arrests for free speech, I mean, are any of those convictions unsafe now, would you say, or is that jumping the gun?
It's jumping the gun.
Because that seems to be the suggestion on Twitter, so I thought I'd better ask.
Yeah, no, sometimes Twitter lawyers are right. Most of the time they're wrong. But no, that doesn't mean that. I mean, I think that some of the convictions will be built on sound evidence, and the reality is that we have very, very broad speech laws in this country, meaning that it's very, very easy to commit an offence. Yeah. And so if the cases do go up to the Court of Appeal, which is where they would have to go in order to be quashed, there may, the court would take a view on each individual case and the evidence in each individual case and ask whether they weren't, in fact, stirring up racial hatred in what they said. It's actually quite difficult to see from a legal standpoint how this new development would have any impact on any criminal conviction. Because you do, at least, although the laws are very broad, you have to have evidence that there was an intention behind what you said to stir up hatred. Yeah. And although in a lot of the cases going through at the moment, that is a borderline issue for some of these people, there are some that are more clear cut, and that the fact of these new developments will not necessarily mean that the evidence that was used to convict them at the time was wrong or inaccurate. So we'll wait and see. There could be some cases, but at the moment I'm struggling to see how it would happen.
Yeah.
I think it's just a reminder of all this, isn't it, that however we get to the bottom of all of this, this particular case, the implications that it may or may not have, the questions that might want to be asked of government and so on. It's just so important that we have a free and open discussion and that people feel that it is a free and open discussion. I think one of the big impacts of that kind of post-riots period, in which you had the state not simply going after the people who were engaging in and directly inciting violence, but going after people who had posted racist memes, going after people who had said outrageous inflammatory things, but to an audience of a few dozen on their social media feeds. With a level of vigor, shall we say, that we haven't seen them pursue even, violent criminals in the past. It created this impression, and I think also was intended to create the impression that you had to really watch what you say. Yeah. Not what you do, but what you say. The fact that we had, various government Twitter accounts foghorning the words "think before you post." The director of public prosecution saying even retweeting some of this material could land you in prison. That has had a clear impact on people's just felt ability to even discuss these issues, full stop. And I think the surge in membership that the Free Speech Union are reporting is evidence of that. And it's really not good, just because we shouldn't want to chill free discussion and so on. But also when you do have these instances of censorship and potentially even elements of the state being cagey about letting certain bits of information out at certain points in time, it's only going to breed more distrust, and it's going to create a more fertile sort of seedbed for those people who do want to occupy that information vacuum with bigotry and lies and things to just stir up trouble. So it is a reminder that, like, aside from anything else, we need to have a really clear-eyed, free and open debate about this as possible, and we need to really get to grips with the ways in which the response to the Southport riots and the riots that gripped the country obviously went beyond tackling the violent racial hatred that we saw on our streets and that needed to be clamped down hard upon, and became a general kind of chilling of discussion. And that we've got to be able to separate out those parts, otherwise, we're really going to be in trouble, I think.